Morning. So, about 2 weeks ago, I walked into the coffee shop, and Amber was standing there, and she said to me, she simply said, "What do you need, Paul?" And I stopped and I stared at her for a minute, and I said, I need joy. And then I stood there a minute, she just kind of looked at me a little confused. I said, I need hope, I need kindness, I need compassion. And she's just still standing there staring at me, and I'm looking at her, and I said, I need grace. I need humility. I need gentleness. I said, I just need all of these things right now so desperately. And she just stood there, and she looked at me, and she's like, I can give you a latte. And I said, that's the beginning of joy. So give me a latte. And so I walked out of there, and I just realized in that moment, it had been leading up to that, but I just have been living through for about the last month and a half, 2 months, this season where it just seems like every single day gets a little heavier and a little heavier. And the chains feel like they're a little stronger, and they're holding me down a little bit more each day, each moment. And as I've been going through this, it's just been a season in my life that, to be honest with you, has been difficult. There's been days when I'm like, I don't even want to get up. I don't want to go in and work. I don't want to go in and love people. I don't want to do anything like that. And before I became a pastor, I was a human. And I dealt with these things. And now that I'm a pastor, I feel like sometimes I'm not allowed to deal with them anymore. And I have to be honest with you, who I am as a person is I try to be transparent all the time. I try to just be who I am, and I try to say things the way that I believe that I'm supposed to say things, and yet I still need to be filled with grace and hope and mercy and gentleness. And so as I've been studying for Colossians, that we're looking at Colossians chapter 4 this morning, but as I've been preparing, one of the things that I like to do is I like to read the entire book over and over and over again in different translations, and just to really digest what it's about and to look at who Paul was writing to, why he was writing to them, what's the theme of the book, and looking through all of this, wrestling through where I am in life right now. I kept coming back to this passage in chapter 3 in verse 12. And before we get to chapter 4, I want to just read this real quick. It just says Paul is writing, and keep in mind, he's writing from prison. He's literally in chains. And yet he writes to the church in Colossae. He says, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourself with compassion, with kindness, with humility, with gentleness and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another. If any of you has a grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you. And above all these virtues, put on love. And while I would read and study on chapter 4 over and over and over again, I came back to that passage where he just says, put on love. If you look at this book and who he's writing to, Paul is writing to the church in Colossae. And oftentimes we think that whoever Paul's writing to, that's because he started the church and he lived and breathed with them for a while. But Paul actually never even went to Colossae. He didn't start the church. He had nothing to do with it. Outside of the fact that some people knew Paul, they became Christians and Christ followers, and they went back home and they started this church. And so Paul, in prison, begins to hear about these people in this church in Colossae. He hears about their great faith. He hears about the way they're living. He hears about who they are. And so he writes them this letter of encouragement. And he writes them, he says, this is how you need to continue to live. These are the things that you're doing well. This is what you need to focus on. This is how you need to, as a body, grow and live. These are the things in your life that you need to not have. And he writes this beautiful letter to them. And I think it's amazing to think about how the fact that the Apostle Paul wrote this letter to a group of people who had never even met Paul. And I realize how powerful it is, not only my testimony, but your testimony and us as a church body, and how much power and impact we have, not only in our community, but those people that don't even know who we are. They've just heard about the way we're living and the things that we're doing. Faith, I think, sometimes is something that we just really think it's just kind of something you just believe, and that's good enough, and you just go through your seasons in life. In reality, the way you live as a Christ follower drastically affects the world. And Paul is writing, and there's this one phrase that he says as I've been reading this over and over again. It's just simply in verse 3 in chapter 4, where he writes, I am in chains. I'm in chains. And if you visualize that, Paul's sitting there literally in a prison cell, chained to the wall. And yet he still had it in him to write these letters of encouragement, of hope. He writes them these ways to live. He never says, look, I'm in a horrible situation. Come help me. Come free me. Come get me out. Send a lawyer. He just simply says, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourself with compassion, with humility, with gentleness and patience. Bear with one another. Forgive one another. If that was me, I would be praying, Lord, please send someone to get me out of here. Get me out of this situation. And yet Paul is saying, this is where I need to be. You see, I believe that when you become a Christ follower, you enter into a spiritual battle. And you enter into this beautiful relationship with our Creator, who fills our lives full of grace and hope and mercy. And yet, the further I seem to step into my faith, the harder sometimes the struggle gets, because I believe there's this spiritual battle that is all around us, that if we're not aware of it, Satan has this tendency to begin to reach in and grab us and hold us back and say things like, you can't do this. And we struggle and we live in the place where our chains are. And we allow it to anchor us and hold us down and say, this is as far as I can go, and this is as much as I can do, and I can't handle really anything else, so I'm just going to stay here. Maybe I'll show up on Sunday every now and then. Maybe I'll sing 1 out of 5 songs. But I'm bailing as soon as it's done. And I don't want anything to do with this the rest of the week. But then next Sunday, maybe I'll come back again. And so we look at faith and who it is and how we live it out. And I look at how Paul lived, and he says, look, I'm in chains. I'm chained against a wall. That's not going to slow me down. It's not going to stop the impact that I'm going to have of the people around the world. He's in jail, and yet he's transforming the entire known world by these letters that he's writing. These letters of encouragement and hope. You see, I realize for me, as I've been living through this season where these chains have felt heavy, there's been times when my phone is just blowing up and I'm getting texts and I'm getting emails and I'm getting phone calls, and I don't have the power within me to even answer it sometimes. I just look at it and go, I can't right now. And so if I've ignored your texts, ignored your phone calls, ignored your emails, that's part of my personal issues, and I struggle with that on a daily basis anyway. But I apologize if I've walked by you with my head down, if I've been stuck in my chains, in my area of pain right now. I apologize if I have not been there for you. Because, I realize it doesn't matter where we are spiritually. It doesn't matter where we are physically. It matters what we are doing with this spiritual calling that God has placed in all our lives. We will deal with hardships. We will be in chains. We will be in these times of seasons of agony. And yet through that, we have to find joy. And even bigger, we have to find grace and mercy. You see, when Paul writes this, he writes at the end of the book of Colossians in chapter 4, verse 2. He's written this great book, and now he writes this conclusion. He says, this is how I want to leave you. And so he writes simply this. He says, devote yourselves to prayer, being watchful and thankful, and pray for us too, that God may open the door for our message, so that we may proclaim the mystery of Christ, for which I am in chains. Pray that I may proclaim it clearly as I should. As Josh and the band were singing that song, there's a phrase in the middle of the song where it just simply says, if you believe it. If you believe it. Paul is writing here, look, if you believe, you need to devote yourself to prayer. Because prayer is foundational for who we are as Christ followers. It can be these massive, huge prayers, and these prayers of God, just help me to get up and go through my day today. Help me to have grace. Help me to have mercy. God, bring joy into my life in spite of where I am physically. And as he is writing this, he's telling them to be faithful and purposeful and to be watchful and to be thankful. And this phrase, we're saying, if you believe it. I think it's somewhat easy to believe in Jesus. I don't have to explain it. I don't have to fully comprehend it. But I can get to a point in my life where you go, yeah, I believe. I believe that Jesus is the Son of God. I believe that he died for me. I believe that he gives me grace. It's hard to accept that. But I can believe. I'll be honest with you. I can't think of a time in my life where I haven't believed. I grew up in church. My dad grew up in church. My grandfather grew up in church. It's been in my family for generations. And then sometimes he asks the question, what if I was born someplace else? What if I wasn't raised this way? And then I take a step back and say, I'm so grateful for the fact that I was raised this way, that I have had this relationship with Jesus. But it's one thing to have a relationship with Jesus, and it's another thing to just believe. If I believe, all I really need to do, let's be honest, is show up on Sundays, pray every now and then, sing one out of the 5 songs, and go about my day. The problem is that my day becomes a week, my week becomes a month, my month becomes a year, and I look back and go, what am I really doing with the things that I'm believing in? Am I acting on them, or am I just believing in them? You see, when we believe, you have to at some point get to this idea of prayer. When Paul says, devote yourself to prayer, being watchful and thankful, he's saying that because foundationally, if you are to become a Christ follower, if you are to go into this relationship with him, at some point your life needs to become radically changed and transformed. You see, Paul is writing to the church in Colossae, again, who he hasn't met. But it's a group of people whose lives have been radically flipped. And everything about who they are is about this Jesus. And I wonder what it would be like as if we, as a whole group, come together and not just worship, not just believe, but we're radically transformed. That first phrase, if you believe it, you have to devote yourselves to prayer. It then goes on in verse 5, it says, be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. The original translation was walk in wisdom toward them that are without. Walking is active, it's doing, it's moving towards something. So he's saying being wise in the way that you act toward outsiders, walk in wisdom toward them. Not away from them, not staying still, but walking towards them. He's obviously talking about faith and how we live and what we're called to do, and he's saying, continue to walk towards those people that don't know who Jesus is. And if you're going to walk towards them, walk in wisdom. And if you're walking in wisdom, then understand that the way you live, the way you speak, the way you do everything in your life tells everyone around you a story. He says, make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversations be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. Not just a few, not just the ones you want to talk to, everyone. You know, the line in the song went, if you believe it, it then says, if you receive it. Receive it, like I said, is active. Believing is one thing, but if I'm receiving it, I need to do something with it. Paul says, make the most of every opportunity. For years and years and years of my life, I believed, but I don't know how much I really received. And I remember a transformational moment in my life was a time when I absolutely didn't expect it because I was just watching a movie. And I'm watching this movie, Dead Poet Society, and I've spoke on that movie before because it just radically transformed my life. And I'm sitting there and I'm watching this movie, and the professor, he leans forward, he's with a bunch of kids, and he just whispers, Carpe diem. And they all kind of look at him, and he says, seize the day. He says, think about the moments, the conversations, and they were looking at a picture of all these ancient people that had come before them, and he says, you don't recognize or know anybody in this case, in these pictures. And I realize as I'm sitting there watching this, and I'm thinking about who I am spiritually, how I'm living, what I'm doing, the conversations I'm having, the way I'm pursuing life, the way I'm speaking to people, are the things that I'm doing going to be life-changing? Are they going to transform people's lives? Are they going to really change the world that I'm living in? Or am I just existing? And I realized, yeah, I believe. But man, how much have I really received it? How much am I walking in wisdom? How much am I making the most of every opportunity? And it really shifted how I thought about faith. And then it says, let your conversations be always full of grace. Do you know how massively impossible it feels to let all of my conversations be full of grace? Because let's be honest, sometimes people are just stupid. And I know I'm not supposed to say that in church, but in this authentic place where we're supposed to be, just sometimes you're like, I don't know if I can give you grace right now. And yet, Paul sits here and says, let your conversations be always full of grace. I believe that scriptures, when they speak to us, don't give us things that we can't do. That doesn't mean it's not difficult. It doesn't mean it feels impossible. But is this heaviness in my life, is this burden that I feel like I've been carrying around, these moments where I don't even want to talk to people, I've continually been coming back to this where it says, be always full of grace. Man, it's so hard to do. And then he says, seasoned with salt. You see, I don't know what you do when you're depressed. But when I'm depressed, some people go and eat chocolate cake. Some people eat ice cream. I just eat salt. I could eat it straight, maybe. Chips, nachos, anything. My wife will, on a regular basis, will sit down to eat, and she'll say to me, I already salted that. And I said, oh, really? That's great. Because I'm going to put some more salt on it. And she said, Paul, that's not good for you. It's unhealthy. Seasoned with salt. It's in the Bible. I went to the doctor this last week, and I asked them, give me a checkup, make sure everything's fine. They said, you're extremely healthy. I said, can I keep eating salt? They said, yes. I looked at my wife later that night, and I said, I can eat much salt as I want. If you're a doctor, don't come talk to me. I don't care what you say. But he says, seasoned with salt so that others may know how to answer. Now, salt obviously gives things flavor. It makes it taste better. It was rare in these days, and if somebody sat down and offered you salt, that was unbelievable. But more so, if you think about how they preserved things. If they were just going to store meat, they couldn't put it in the refrigerator. They had to pack it with salt so that it would stay good. You see, in their day, if they didn't season it with salt, it went bad. And you think about how we live our faith. If you're never doing anything with your faith, what's really happening? Like, is it anything good coming of it? And I believe that we're called to be in this battle, so to say, where we are going forward daily and saying, I know I'm in chains. I know I have a struggle. I know I have this pain. But if I'm going to believe, if I'm going to believe in this, then I have to devote myself to prayer. And at some point, I've got to start receiving this, where it takes me into this deeper level of understanding what it means to walk in wisdom. And I have to continually fill my life to try and be full of grace. And I have to season everywhere I go, the conversations I have, the people I'm around, I have to season it with salt. So they don't leave going, what is going on with that guy? What's wrong with him? And I realize over the last month or so, this is maybe where I've failed, because there have been these times when I'm like, I don't think I left that person seasoned with salt. I don't think I entered that conversation full of grace. You know, and then it shifts here. It goes to the final greetings, it says. And what I found is I drew a line across my Bible there. Because if I'm looking at these things, if you believe it, if you receive it, that's kind of head knowledge and heart knowledge. And Paul is writing throughout the book of Colossians, he's saying this is how you need to live. This is what you need to do. This is what you need to place in your life. And yet now it goes to this section. The song said, if you believe it, if you receive it, if you can feel it, testify. In other words, your faith needs to become this story that is pouring into the lives around you. You have to consciously make an effort to bring the love and hope of Jesus to those that are all around you. And so Paul writes this final greetings. And as I've been reading through it, it's like just a bunch of names, and it didn't really mean anything to me. But what he's doing is he's saying, these are the people that are on my team. And you don't think the power of seeing somebody's name, the power of seeing somebody that is living with somebody, or the power of just seeing who a person is. You know, the end credits, it's like this is the end credits of a movie. Everyone gets up and leaves because the names are irrelevant. It doesn't really matter. But I sit there oftentimes and I wonder who that guy is. And sometimes I'll sit there and I'll wait till about halfway through and I'll see a name and I'll just Google them. I just want to see who they are. And it's irrelevant unless your name is in the credits. And I remember once I had my name at the end in the credits, and it was at the very end of the credits. I really didn't do much, but I got my name in there somehow. And I sat there for the whole time, and did you know the credits go faster and faster and faster? And at some point, I'm literally going like this, Paul Gunther Jr., boom, and it was gone. My moment, like literally was 0.5 of a second. The entire theater was empty, but I'm like, my name was just on the screen. I contributed. You know, as Paul writes this, he says, these are the people that are on my team. And if you dive deeper into the lives of who these guys are and these people are that were living and breathing with Paul, it's powerful. You know, as a kid, as a boy who lived in a foreign country, as a missionary kid in the jungle, we used to play war all the time. And we'd always break up into teams. And then the teams would break up into, we had the generals, and we'd have the sergeants. And this is literally, I don't know if you guys did this, but we did this every day almost. And I never wanted to be the general. I never wanted to be the sergeant. I always wanted to be the guy in the front lines. And my goal in life was to my goal in our half-hour game of war in the jungle, the way you played, if you saw somebody, you simply had to point your gun at them and say bang, and then you had to yell their name, and then they're out of the game. My goal was to be able to sneak all the way up to the enemy and get almost face to face and kill him with my knife. Now, I know this is a bad sermon analogy, but it was an invisible knife, and it wasn't real, and it wasn't a real war, and I would jump out of the bushes and go, bang, you're dead. And then I didn't know knives made a bang sound, but I would say it anyway. And they'd always say to me, Paul, how'd you get here? I'm like, don't worry about it. I just did it. You know, if you look at when you're assembling your team, and when you look at war, the reality of war, and the reality of maybe even a basketball team, you have people that have the giftedness to be on the front lines or to be on the starting team. You have those that are standing behind the lines of the reserves that are lifting them up, they're supplying, or the subs. You have the coaches. You have these two makeups of this team. Paul is writing and says, these are the people on my team. And the section here, it says in verse 7, it says, Tychicus will tell you all the news about me. He is a dear brother, a faithful minister, and a fellow servant in the Lord. I'm sending him to you for the express purpose that you may know about our circumstances, and that he may encourage your hearts. He is coming with Onesimus, our faithful and dear brother who is one of you. They will tell you everything that is happening here. They will testify. And if you know the backstory of this is such a powerful statement, because the church of Colossae was started by a man named Philemon and a man named Epaphras. They became Christ followers when Paul was in Ephesus, and they were with him for a season of time. When they returned home, they went to Colossae and they started this church. And this church began to grow and it began to do these amazing things, and people began to talk about it. Now, Philemon had a slave. Philemon's slave's name was Onesimus. And at some point, Onesimus runs away and leaves and ends up in Rome, somehow with Paul, when Paul is in prison. And Onesimus sits there with Paul. And Paul begins to pour into his life, and Onesimus becomes a Christian. And Paul then says to Onesimus, I've written this letter. I need you to take it back to the people you ran away from. Imagine that feeling when you're called to go back to the exact place that you don't want to go. But sometimes when your life is transformed by Jesus, he calls you from these places in your past and says, I need you to go back to these places. I need you to tell them my story. I need you to testify to them everything that is going on. And so Paul sends these two to testify, to go and say, here is what is going on in my life. I believe that each and every one of us have a calling to testify as well. We gather here on Sundays, but that's just for an hour or so. We are mandated to go out into our community and go out into the world, because the power of how we live literally can change the world. I have people on a regular basis will come to me and say, Paul, are you preaching? I said, yeah. And I said, and then they'll lean over and they said, I brought a friend, so make it good. I'm like, what? I'm still human. I'll do my best. And they say they really need Jesus. And then I'll lean back to them and I say, well, then you tell them about Jesus. You're the one living with them. You're the one that's going through life with them. You're the one that you have brought them here. I'll say what I feel like I'm supposed to say, but you're the one that can transform their life. You know, these chains that hold us down, it feels like we can't move forward sometimes. It feels like we can't testify. And yet Paul, as he's writing here, says, I am in chains. I need you to testify and tell the truth of where I'm at in life. As I said, my life for the last month and a half has just been hard. It's taken everything in me sometimes to just go throughout my day. When my two oldest kids, we adopted them when they were 2.5 and 3.5. And to be honest, the first 2 years of their life, the only way to explain it is it was hell on earth. I mean, not with me. Their life was just horrific. Abuse, mentally, just absolutely broke them down. And it just makes me so angry to see what the world sometimes does to kids and what it does to us. And this world just consistently is bombarding us. But the one thing we told our kids is when they came into our life, was we told them we will love you forever. We may not have created you, but there's nothing you can do to have us stop loving you. And it's been hard. There's been this season recently where my son has just wandered. And as a parent, that's hard to see. And as I was sitting there a couple weeks ago, honestly, we've been praying for him and we've been loving on him. And one of the things, we got a phone call. It said that Kevin had been arrested. And it just broke me. It brought me to my knees. My wife and I just so painful to live through. And as I was looking through this with him, what I've realized over and over again is how we're called to pray, how we're called to have grace, how we're called to unconditionally continue to move forward with this hope that Jesus can change and bring us all and make us new. And so I stand before you here broken. I stand before you with this idea of faith is hard. It's incredibly difficult sometimes. And there's been days where it's like, I don't know how we can even move forward. And yet Paul says here, I'm in chains, that I may proclaim the mystery of Christ. And what I know about my son is he's a person that loves Jesus. But who he is as an individual, because of the way his first couple years, he's a 20-year-old man with a 13-year-old mind. And reality for him sometimes is difficult to grasp, and what we see and what he sees are different things. And yet he still deserves grace and hope, and we still are called to lift him up. But honestly, as I stand here and I testify about the life that I'm living through, there's not a point where I can waver, where I can say, look, this pain is too much. I can't handle it. God is still God. Jesus is still Jesus. He transforms my life and he can transform my son's life. And I believe as Christ followers, we're called to be honest with each other, and we're called to stand before each other and say, this is where I'm at. I need you to lift me up. Because as Paul was writing, he said, this is my team. And the team that he was with were lifting him up on a daily basis. And I believe that's the only way that he was able to write this and to live this way. He then writes this. He says, my fellow prisoners, Aristarchus sends you his greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. Jesus, who is called Justus, also sends greetings. These are the only Jews among my co-workers for the kingdom of God, and they have proved a comfort to me. You see, in war, we have our people that are on the front lines. And when it gets real, they've been trained and they're strong enough to stand there. In the same way, spiritually, there are certain people that are called to be right there in the front lines with people. They're called to stand with those that are struggling. I believe Paul was this unbelievable leader, but there was this group of men that stayed there right with him the entire time, knowing that this could cost them their life. These guys stayed with him. But then it says it proved a comfort to me. Like I said, this month has been hard. It's been unbelievably painful. But there's been a group of people that have stood with us. And my wife sent out an email to this team yesterday and just said, this is where we're at. This is where our son's at. This is what he's going through. This is how you can not only lift him up, but lift us up. And it's amazing to see when you live through these seasons where it feels as if the chains are so heavy, and yet you can still find comfort. You can still find grace. You can still find hope. Yesterday, my wife wrote a poem on what this season has been like and how comfort has been in our lives and in the places that we never really expected to find them.
Comfort. It's a warm, fuzzy blanket for my soul. It's what makes me feel like I will be okay, even when nothing really changes. Comfort is God's promise to those who suffer and mourn. It's what carries us through the valleys of the shadow of death. Comfort can be missed with the "what do you need?" question, because honestly, sometimes it's impossible to know what I really need. Comfort can be spoken, but more often, it's communicated with action. Comfort is dinner dropped off just to say we care. It's a bright bouquet of flowers given with a hug and some shared tears. Comfort is the friend who shows up and says, "Here's the plan," and then she sticks around long enough to help you finish that plan. Comfort is an impromptu lunch delivery from friends. It's the texted prayer that speaks what my own words cannot. Comfort is flower pots left on my porch. It's the "you are loved" message on my coffee cup. Comfort is the protein smoothie put straight into my hand when that friend knows I probably haven't eaten all day. Comfort is an invitation to join, but it's also the understanding when I just can't this time. Comfort is the coworker who says, "No problem, I've got this for you." It's the forgiveness that's quickly given when I forgot about our meeting. Comfort is coffee on the couch in silence with a friend. It's the knowing hug given when words are not needed. Comfort is God's heart through human hands reaching my soul. It's the mending action to heal what's broken. Comfort requires me to be humbled and dependent on God and others. It's the journey I must walk to become a comforter. Comfort is a warm, fuzzy blanket for my soul. It's what reminds me that I will be okay, even when nothing changes.
As these group of people lived with Paul, he says over and over they were a comfort to me. Whether they were physically there with them, or in verse 12 it says, "Epaphras, who is one of you and a servant of Christ Jesus, sends greetings. He is always wrestling in prayer for you, that you may stand firm in all the will of God, mature and fully assured." You see, not only are there people that are called to be in the front lines, but there are people that are called to be the supply team, to stand behind and lift people up. And there's been people that have said, "Look, I can't really physically be there with you, but I'm going to pray for you every single day." And to be honest, I felt that. I felt that power of prayer as it lifts us up and allows us to walk through our days. And it says he is always wrestling in prayer. It's the same word as agonizing. And it's when Jesus was praying so hard, he was sweating blood. They used this original language for the athletes as they were training for the Olympics. It said they would wrestle. They would agonize. They would work to the point where it's so difficult. Have you ever prayed for someone or had somebody pray for you where they're just wrestling through this prayer for you? I would encourage you at some point to continue and to add this into your life, because all of us live through these seasons where it feels as if we're in chains, and there's nothing worse than to do that by yourself. And so not only do you need to have people pouring into you, but you need to be pouring into the lives of others. And then Paul says this at the end. He says in verse 14, "Our dear friend Luke, the doctor, who traveled with Paul on a regular basis." And then he says, "And Demas, send greetings." The interesting thing about Demas is he's mentioned in Philemon, where it says, "My fellow worker Demas." And so Demas, he lifts him up and he says, "This is this guy who was walking through life with me and serving with me." In Colossians, he's just mentioned. The only thing it says is his name. The last time Paul writes about him is in 2 Timothy, and he says, "For Demas." because he loved this world and has deserted me. You see, Demas was the guy that wanted to be in the front lines. He was the guy that wanted to be there when it got heavy and got hard. And yet, when reality hit, when his faith was tested, he bailed and he took off. And you just need to know, if you believe it, if you receive it, at some point, if you're living it, it's going to get difficult. Your faith will be tested, and it's going to feel as if you can't take another step. The question is, who is your team that is surrounding you and lifting you up? Paul ends with this. He just simply says, I, Paul, write this greeting in my own hand. Remember my chains. Grace be with you. You see, chains can hold you down physically. They can trap you emotionally. But they can never hold you down spiritually. There can never be a moment where it feels as if this is too much, I can't do it, where God will abandon you. That won't happen. It says his grace is sufficient. This idea of hope, this truth of grace and compassion and kindness and humility and gentleness and patience. And then it says, above all virtues, put on love. The chains are heavy. Physically, it feels as if you can't move. Emotionally, it feels as if you can't take another step. But spiritually, God will never abandon you. My son came into the courtroom last Friday, and he came in chains. And I sat there, and honestly, it broke me. I remember when he was 3, when we just got him, and we're at church. It's the Christmas performance, and my son is standing in the front row on the stage, jumping up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down. I'm like, this kid's broken. There's something wrong with him. But I saw this beautiful innocence as he grew up. And he looked at me when he walked in, and I just said, I love you. I love you, buddy. Those chains are real. Those chains hold us to the point where it feels as if we're breaking. But the truth is, spiritually, there's nothing that can hold me down. The only thing that can happen is I'm lifted up. The only thing that can happen is as I put my faith more and more in Jesus, and the harder it gets, the more that I have to testify that he's real. The more I have to show people that he rescues, he still loves. Paul writes in Colossians, he says, whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus. Not some of what you do, not what you do on Sundays for an hour, not 1 out of 5 songs. Whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of Jesus. And I don't know if this is because I was a missionary kid or because I was raised in church, but oftentimes I sit here as we sing and it feels as if my hands are chained to the ground, and I watch other people will raise their hands and sing, and I'm like, man, they are fully engaging in worship. I want that. I want to be where they're at. I asked Josh to do Amazing Grace because it's a song that brings us back to, in a sense, our roots, but it's also this song that frees us. The chains have been broken. And I don't know where you are at physically, emotionally, spiritually, but I do know that God's grace is sufficient. I do know that his hope is real. I do know that his love is comforting. I do know that whatever situation he can rescue in. And I don't know how hard it feels as if you're chained down. I do know that he does release those chains, whether it takes moments or years. And I know that he looks deep into our souls and says, I love you, I love you, I love you. So as we sing, I would encourage you to stand up and understand and know that your chains have been broken, that he is looking into your life and he is simply saying, I love you.